Tervetuloa Iltalehden studioon. Meillä on tänään paikan päällä erikoisvieras, venäläinen oppositiopoliitikko Ilja Ponomarjov, joka on Venäjän entinen kansanedustaja ja Duuman jäsen. Nykyään hän asuu Kiovassa ja taistelee sieltä käsin Ukrainan puolella Venäjän hyökkäyssotaa vastaan. Welcome to the studio, Ilja Ponomarjov. It is great to have you here.
Thanks for having me.
You were a member of the Russian State Duma already some 15 years ago, and you served as a member...
That's 15 years ago, I think. No, it's a long time ago, yeah. I finished in 2016, yeah.
Exactly, yeah. You served for a long time. And you were also considered as quite an exceptional member since you were, for example, the only member who voted against the annexation of Crimea in 2014. So since you have been following Putin's Russia very closely for more than a decade now, what is your analysis of the current state of the country and how did Putin end up in the situation that he is in today?
Well, I think that Russia, unfortunately, is in a very dangerous state. I think that the country right now is at the verge of collapsing. It's in a very unstable condition. I think that the war that Putin has started against Ukraine can be compared even not with the worst cases of imperialist wars. I think that probably the best parallel would be with some religious wars of the medieval centuries. He thinks that like Russians and the Ukrainians are one nation. That's what he says to his audience, to Russians. And that Ukrainians, being part of this one nation, actually betrayed us because they wanted to be with the West rather than to be with Russia. And that's the reason for the war.
So, as mentioned, you were against the annexation of Crimea already back in 2014. So, looking back to that time, did you expect already at that point that the annexation could lead to the situation that we are in today?
Unfortunately, yes, and that's what I wrote at that time, again. But in general, of course, the historical logic from the very beginning was pointing us that that would happen at one point of time.
If you think of the situation today, to what extent does opposition still exist in Russia?
Opposition as the organized force is not existent. That's, a reality that we have to state, and I think that's pretty obvious. There are opposition-minded people, for sure, and there are many. And it's way more numbers than many people do believe. Sociological surveys, they say, okay, maybe like 20-25% of Russians do oppose the war. But what does it mean, like 25% of Russians oppose the war? That means that 35 million people are opposing it to this war, and that's official number, because I do believe that the actual number is larger. Yeah. But okay, even like officially they admit that it's 35 people. That means it's more people on the side of Ukraine in Russia than Ukrainians. So, and that's the reality that we need to understand. A lot of people are against this war.
Yes, but they are silent.
They are silent because they see no way out, and that's exactly because the opposition does not exist. And to make them move, you actually need to present them with a political alternative. And right now it's impossible to create this political alternative from within the country, because everybody who just says something immediately gets arrested and sent to jail. And it's a very noble thing to be arrested and go to jail.
Opposition that might exist in Russia. So if you think that the war still continues, and it seems the Western support is as well continuing, do you think that at some point this could have some sort of an effect internally in Russia, whether it's the people or maybe even someone from Putin's inner circle? Or
no, that definitely will have an impact. And I would say that the main revolutionary force in Russia right now is the military forces of Ukraine. The more they are victorious over Putinist army, the closer we are to the regime change in the country. It would be the end of the Russian Federation as we know it, and we will create a new Russia, which would be democratic, free, like Germany of today, which would be a member of international community. I definitely think that one day we'll be a member of the European Union and NATO and all other organizations, international organizations. We'll live as one family.
You have also recently published a book called Does Putin Have to Die?, in which you present your plan of how Russia could one day become a democracy without Putin and Putinism. So what is your opinion What needs to happen in Russia in order to Putin's regime to fall?
I think that in Russia there could be two possible scenarios of the regime change. First of all, and I think that's a very probable thing that would happen one day, but I don't think it would be successful, but I think it would be such an attempt to create a certain coup at the top as an attempt to survive over Putin to save the system. Right now there is a constitutional procedure that if Putin, for whatever reason, is not capable to carry on, the prime minister should take over his place. And the current prime minister, Mikhail Mishustin, is a very neutral, relatively liberal, pro-Western, technocratic person who is not directly linked with the war crimes and all those atrocities that were happening in Ukraine. He has all the responsibility for this because he is the prime minister, so he allocates money for the military production, he facilitates the army, he obviously is not objecting for this aggression, but nevertheless he is not in the front lines himself. And that's why a significant part of Russian elites would believe that he could be the mediator with the West. And when I say Mishustin and he, I mean it could be not Mishustin, but it could be a similar person. They have other candidates like this. They have Sergei Kirienko, who is currently political chief in Kremlin, or they have Alexei Kudrin, who is the former minister of finance. So somebody of that type, we call system liberals. So people with neoliberal economic views, but which are loyal to the regime. And they could be this bridge. And, you know, there would be definitely a certain part of Russian elites which would try to keep those guys and by this survive themselves. I think that the West would be very much tempted to actually take such an offer because if the same Mishustin would be coming and saying, okay, we will end the war, we will withdraw with troops, and you can take the reserves that you arrested in Europe to give them to Ukraine, you know, to facilitate the recovery, you know, but you just don't touch us. And I think that many Western politicians would advocate for it. I think it's a threat for us because I think that if this offer would be taken, then the system would be preserved, and that means another 20 years, and they will be back with the same threat as what we saw now. I think that the system should be dismantled. No more this modern-day monarchy. Second scenario, which I think would be happening, is that while the elites would try to rescue themselves, there would be a popular uprising, which would try to eliminate the system. And here our job is to support it as much as possible. And again, in a situation of military defeat, I think that this is very, very possible outcome. As we saw it in not October, but February 1917. That was a very similar process with very similar factors and with very similar driving forces.
You have also claimed that Putin will not live to see 2024, which is already next year. So what is it that you expect happening during the upcoming months?
Now again, the all attention, you know, all the events will be happening in Ukraine. They will be happening in the fighting zone. Now very much dependent on when the Ukrainian offensive would start and which results would be achieved. I think it would be, at the end of the day, very opportunistic. So Ukrainian army obviously is not thinking about how that would impact Moscow. They are thinking more, you know, what advances they can make at the field of war. And they can push on Zaporizhia direction to slice the Russian army into two parts, separate Crimea from Donbass group of military units. But they can also advance in the direction of Crimea. If they would go in the direction of Crimea and would be successful, that's it. I think that would be the trigger event. If that would be happening there, maybe then that will trigger changes in Russia. Maybe not. Maybe the agony would continue for a while. But again, I think that this year would be the year when we will see very significant changes in Russia.
One day Putin will be gone no matter what, whether it's during the upcoming year or later. But I'm wondering what will be happening then. So do you think that only Putin either stepping down or being overthrown, do you think that this is enough to shift Russia towards becoming a more democratic country? Or do you think that something bigger needs to happen in order to see this kind of shift in the administration?
Thank you for a very good question. Because exactly many people believe that the problem is with Putin himself. But the problem is not with him. The problem is with the system. So right now we need to roll the situation back. We need to create a new constitution. We need to create a new legislation. We need to rebuild the whole system of power in Russia in a totally different way. We need to basically set all the regions free and ask them, guys, do you want to be in one country? If you want to be in one country, what kind of powers you are willing to delegate to the top? And then the system would be fair, balanced, and it would be based on the interest of the ordinary people down below in the regions, and not what Moscow decides, to throw them as a bone, as certain prerogatives that they may have.
So you are saying that the problem is much bigger than Putin himself. So why is Putin so important to the whole system? Why do we discuss so much about Putin's health concerns and whether he might die soon or no?
We very often take Putin as some kind of monarch, as a tsar, as a dictator, which sits at the top, and administers the system and manages all these people around him. That's not an accurate comparison. He is rather the spider in the center of the web. He is a KGB person. He's not a military guy, he's not a party guy, he's a KGB guy. So his job is to manipulate. He's a brilliant psychologist, and he knows how to balance people. And by doing so, he basically destroyed all the institutions within the country. So he created his own system. The problem is with all the relationships within the system that were built, but they all are, at the end of the day, linked to one particular figure, one particular human being, which is Vladimir Putin, who is as an arbiter, as the ultimate judge, balances all the interests. And that's also the reason why I'm saying that all the attempts to create this coup, at the end of the day, they are doomed to fail. Because without this arbiter, there would be too many powerful people which immediately would start fighting with each other for different resources, and the system would immediately start falling apart. But then you need to present it with something else. And this something else needs to be created by someone. It needs to be visualized for people. It needs to be formalized in advance before those changes will start happening. And that's exactly what we are doing at the moment.
Yeah, so you're currently also working on this alternative government for Russia with some other opposition leaders. And you're working from Poland. So what is the situation with this initiative at the moment?
I wouldn't say that we're working just from Poland, because we have a very important center, as I said, in Kyiv, in Ukraine, and that's where I'm personally located, because it's very important to be in the front lines fighting. From the very first day was fighting alongside with Ukrainian army, and still now I'm very often in the front lines, and we have so-called Legion of Free Russia, which is a military unit which is there at the front line. So it's important to be in Ukraine. But at the same time, political system, political structure to create in Ukraine is impossible because it's a fighting country. So it needs to be created elsewhere, and we found perfect mutual understanding with Poland, and that's where our second leg is located. And what was started there, it was an initiative of 59 former deputies of different levels in Russia, members of federal parliament, State Duma, members of regional parliaments, and even municipal deputies. And they decided to join forces to create a shadow parliament. Because of what I was saying, that whatever system needs to replace the current one, it needs to be put in writing, what we are talking about. It's not enough to say that we are for parliamentary republic or decentralization of power. All the opposition people in Russia currently, they repeat this mantra, that that's what we want. But, you know, when you're asking people what do they understand under decentralization of power or parliamentary procedures, nobody could clearly explain. So it needs to be put as the legal acts. And that's what the parliament started to do. And obviously, at the end of the day, for the parliament, the objective would be to create a shadow government. And again, in the situation of parliamentary republic, that's exactly how it should happen. But I think it's a little bit early to talk about this, because government needs to be able to govern. And right now, it's very problematic. So right now, we are creating the framework, this vision of future Russia. And the next Congress, so we are meeting in the plenary sessions once a quarter. And the next one would be in February, exactly in the same day, so it's 1 year anniversary of the invasion in Ukraine. And we will be passing the act on peace, so the way how the war would end. And at that time, we also would hear the draft of the new constitution, which would lay out the new constitutional layout in the country.
So the aim of this alternative government would be not to overthrow Putin, but to take over once he's gone, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Again, politics is something where you deal with the proposition that is in the menu. You cannot talk to a chef when you're coming to a restaurant and say, you know, I want this and that, if it's not on the menu. So we need to put this proposition on the menu. We need to say, if not Putin, then whom? If not Putin, then what? And it has to be very clear political alternative. It needs to be created. Right now, none of the well-known names of the Russian opposition is not on the political menu in Russia. Neither Khodorkovsky, nor Navalny, nor myself were not listed anywhere. I was when I was member of parliament, and that's exactly the reason why they wanted me go. Because they don't want to give Russian people the possibility to choose us somehow. So we need to create an alternative system of power to present it and make sure that at least some of the existing elites and obviously ordinary people would actually switch.
So as we were discussing, we were saying that Putin might be gone already this year. So do you think that this alternative government would be ready to be an option already this year?
Definitely, yes. That's what we are working on. And I think that by mid-year, it would be in the shape when it could be recognized by international countries. And I very much hope that Finland would be among them.
I have one last question for you. When and how do you see the Ukrainian war ending?
I think it would end with the liberation of Crimea. But still, most probable situation is when firstly there's a military defeat and then a change of power in Russia. But I think that the wind definitely is blowing in that direction. And I think that this year we will see it.
Thank you very much for the interview, Ilja Ponomarjov. Tähän päättyy lähetyksemme. Kiitoksia seurasta ja näkemiin.